رسول الله.
الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In the introduction, one of you asked a question about when we were discussing about identity, that this is something very confusing. And the reason for me personally, this question of who am I was a big question, is that I grew up as a nomad. Right? My father worked in international finance, so we grew up all over the place. Kind of like the Bedouins, we just pitch a tent somewhere. Well, we didn't pitch a tent, but we lived in Cairo, in the Emirates, and Toronto, London, England, Madrid, Spain, and I'm missing a whole bunch of things. Every summer we'd go to Karachi, and in the middle there was short hops in different other places. And then we came back to Canada. The question arises, who am I? And there are many possible answers to that, but what does that identity mean? And what does that identity mean? Even, for example, am I Pakistani or am I Indian? And that's a very political and daunting challenge. And there's, of course, tests for some identity. How do you test whether you're Indian or Pakistani? No, the food, no, not really.
That defines who you are.
Yeah, there's actually a test. The test is, which cricket team do you support, right? Like if India plays Pakistan, which cricket team do you support? Tests your identity. Maybe, because identity is more complicated than that. Because could you support one country but identify, or could you identify as both, right? But then what is the consequence of that identity, right? Does it matter? So we're going to look a little bit at this issue of identity and the question of who am I, right? That how can we define our identity, right? How do we define our identity? And I wondered a lot about this in my first year at university, because amongst the many one of the depressing things in my life, I went to a high school that only graduated 5 students in Etobicoke. Our graduating class, believe it or not, was 5 students. And from a high school in Toronto, we only had 2 students who went to the University of Toronto. I was in arts and science. I was doing an economics major. The other student, who I had nothing in common with, but at least we went to the same high school. She was doing sciences, right? I had nothing in common. So it's daunting. You're in this lecture hall with all these people, and you don't know anybody, and you don't even know yourself, right? Which is scarier. So this is a question that many people feel, and in all of that, this question: how do we define our identity, right? And what does that identity mean? So we'll take a little bit of input to get the session started. That I don't necessarily want to know what your identity is, but how do we define our identity? Meaning, at a simple level, identity being who you are, right? The Arabs, of course, when they thought about this term, they came up with in the Islamic age, Arabs made up some words, as those of you who are Arab may know. Amongst them is the word huwiyya, right? Huwiyya is basically being, like, what defines the answer to ma huwa, right? So a person is called huwiyya, and they also, from that same idea, they developed the idea of mahiyya to shay, right? That what is it? So the who is it and what is it? Questions, right? The identity of a person or the identity of a thing, mahiyya to shay, ay haqiqatuhu. So what defines our identity? who we are? How would you answer that question? Like, what defines who we are? Go ahead.
Maybe your occupation,
Okay, your occupation, but your occupation. What else?
Say, I've thought about this question. I
Yeah.
said, I'd say I'm a Canadian Muslim with Pakistani heritage.
Okay, that's your answer to it.
Yeah.
But it's like if you read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Like, what's the answer to life, universe, and everything? That's 42. Then they wondered, what was the question that gave that answer, right? So we don't want to know so much the answer to the question, what is your identity? We want to know the question, right? We want to know the question, that what defines our identity, right? That what defines your identity?
I was thinking maybe actions, principles, beliefs.
Actions. But why do you do those actions?
Based on the principles and beliefs of.
But what are those principles and beliefs? Like, why would you do those actions?
The existence of things.
The heritage of your parents.
The heritage of your parents. Okay.
well, I guess identity, that's not one thing. I mean, it might refer to different things. So, for example, something that controls my actions, like a belief or an ideology that controls my actions, that an identity. And for this, the answer would be Muslim, for example, because Islam is what controls. It's my belief and what controls my
Yeah.
actions.
So we're less interested right now in the answer than the question. So that's a good point. That okay. So an identity, what controls your?
Like my beliefs and what controls my actions.
Okay, my beliefs, what I value, and what controls or what governs my actions. Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, another way that we can think of identity is what you are loyal to, like a place of birth or a country. So
What you're loyal to.
that might be also another way of thinking of it. So in this case, let's say someone might say my identity is Egyptian, Canadian, whatever, if there is such a thing. So that might be another also dimension of it.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can we define it by how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defines it?
We define by how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defines it. Possibly. Right? Okay. Let's get any thoughts? Yeah.
I'm trying to think about the question you're asking.
Yeah. No, like when we talk about, well, this is my identity, right? But what is the question itself? Like what does identity refer to? Like someone says, well, I'm a Real Madrid fan. Great. And there's some people who live and breathe soccer. They know more about what's happening to the Real Madrid team than what's going on at their work. They probably know more about the health of the starting lineup of Real Madrid than they know about their children, spouse, or parents. How's Cristiano Ronaldo doing? They could say, oh, he did really well in training. I don't know if you guys know, but they live stream some of the trainings. But okay, how much actually time did you spend thinking about Real Madrid versus parents, children, or this? I forget, ibadah, worship. But what does that identity mean? Right? Go ahead.
Yes, maybe one way one can define identity is by what they're most engaged in, what they spend most of their time doing.
What they're most engaged in, well, then we're sleeping. We're the sleeping animal, right? Like people sleep, we're the sleeping animal or the entertainment animal, right? Go ahead.
So I would say what defines identity would be the filter through which you see the world.
The filter through which you see the world. Okay.
Someone online was saying your environment.
Your environment, possibly.
It's all about, I think, mostly what your aspiration and values that you are holding to, and also it's reflected in the way that you mostly engage in the way of thinking, feeling,
Yeah.
behaviors, patterns, and where you belong yourself.
Yeah.
Like to which group or
Yeah. So identities, you mentioned a number of really good points. If we just recap them, because you mentioned a number of really good things. So
so basically it's about your behavior patterns.
like how you behave, because it's governed by how you define yourself. And
It's mostly like being triggered or guided through the way your thinkings are, your
yeah,
cognitions,
yeah, and how you think, which is related to what you believe, what you value, and
values that you are holding, like some values
Yeah.
that is upfront to you and always think about that, and
Yeah.
you're preoccupied
yeah,
to and aspire.
yeah. So the values you hold. Any other thoughts?
We are think of identity from a different perspective, from the feeling aspect. Like, for example, being here among in Seeker's Hub, I feel I belong. So the idea of belonging. So you belong to this, like, let's say, tribe of people. What do they think about? What do they believe? How do they act?
Yeah. So it's also there's an emotional aspect to it, right? And like for example, Majnoon Layla, right? His identity was that he was madly in love with Layla, right? As he said, as actually someone said, ascribing a line to him, تسميت بالمجنون من ألم الهوى وصارت بي الأمثال في الحي تضرب. I was called the mad one from the deep pains of my passion. And I began to be used as an example in her neighborhood, right? Because what was his identity? He loved Layla, right? So that's how he defined himself. So there's many ways, actually, if you think about it, that if we just, as a human being, there's so many aspects to our life, right? There's so many aspects to our life. Conceptually, you could identify yourself with any aspect related to you or associated with you, actually, or that you perceive, right? So you ask some people, so tell me about yourself. They say, I'm a foodie, right? 50 years ago in civilized company, for someone to identify themselves, tell me about yourself, I'm a foodie, they would call that, you're a glutton, right? Right? You're a glutton. Like that's considered like aib, right? It's considered really reprehensible. You identify yourself with something that is as perishing as food, right? Other things that people tell me about yourself, I'm a gamer, right? Tell me about yourself, I am, and there's conceptually you can identify with anything. So the question arises that your identity, right? What is your identity really, right? That's a question that religion asks. Who are you? Not in terms of how you perceive yourself, but who you really are, right? Who you really are, right? Because, and I sometimes use this example because it dramatizes the reality of life a little bit. If you're on the train, you woke up and you're on a train, right? And there's a lot to do on the train. It's a really cool train service. So there's a food carriage, there's an entertainment carriage, there's a productivity carriage where you can actually do work. There's all kinds of things. People playing. There's actually like a gaming carriage too. There's all kinds of things. So people will do all kinds of things on the train, right? It's like, who are you? Well, someone says, I'm doing nothing. I'm on a journey. But the real question is, if you step away and ask the question, who are those people, right? Because they may be busy with their fleeting concerns, their thoughts, their perceptions. One carriage is hot, so they say, well, they haven't turned the air conditioning on. I'm part of the oppressed carriage. Another one, there's no water, so I'm fighting for filtered water rights or whatever. People really identify with that because it's a long journey and our carriage isn't getting any water that's clean. Drinking rights campaigner, DRC. But if you step back from that and look at the train and the people within it, the answer may be a little bit different. The answer may be a little bit different. So that's where, if we want to talk about identity, who are you? Then the first question would be, how are you? Right? How are you? And asking the question, how are you, is a very tricky question. One of the great scholars of Islam, Abu Talib al-Makki, in his work, Qut al-Qulub, he said the early Muslims, the Salaf, a lot of them didn't like the question, how are you? Why? Because it lacks sidq, it lacks trueness. Because if you ask someone, how are you? Do I really want to know how you are? Normally. Do I really want to know? Maybe I do, or maybe you do, but generally people say, how are you? And they move on even before you answer the question. It's not asked sincerely. And do people really give you the answer? No, right? So it's not asked with sidq, with trueness, and the answer is, I'm fine. No, right? No, right? Like if you say, okay, how am I? Hold on a second, I need 2 minutes of your time. Imagine someone told you, how are you? Say, can you give me 2 minutes? Let me list how I am. They're like, imagine if you call someone, so how are things? And they say, I need 2 minutes to list. You'll be like, come on, like I called you to go for dinner, not to hear how you are. So they didn't like asking the question. But if you think about the reality of the question, how are you? Right? How are you? Not how are you in this moment. Like on the train, how are you? I'm having fun. Right? Because how are you is either a momentary idea that how are you right now, or the real question, how are you, is how did you come to be? That's a real how are you question. Right? And a lot of questions, they say, not thinking is one of Allah's great blessings on most people. Most people don't think. Right? Because imagine, they even, if you really ask someone, how are you? That's a deep question. Oh my God, like how do you begin answering that question? Like at the moment you're in, it's a difficult question to answer. But the reality of the question, how are you? How do you exist? Whoa, that's a big question. Or how are things? Right? If you think about the question, how are things? Oh, things are fine. Well, that's the moment. Right? That's how are things on the train? It's fine. But how are things? How did the train get here? How is it moving? How are we on the train? Right? That's the real question of identity. Right? That how do things exist? How do things exist? Right? Because who you are, your identity begins with how are you? Right? That how do you exist? That's the first question. Right? And that's where we begin. That how do we perceive reality? Right? How do we perceive reality? And the reality is that most people perceive reality as badly as the question and the answer to how are you? Why? Because if you ask the question, how are you? What seems most real is, how are you in this moment right now? How are you? I'm fine. Right? Like everything short of what they say, Raih and Fajr, like I'm mad. Like anything short of like that, anything, I'm fine. Right? Anything short of Raih and Fajr or Farhan Jiddan. Right? Like I'm going to blow up or I'm really happy, everything else is fine. Right? But that's not the real answer, right? That's not the real answer. The real answer to how are you is how is reality, right? Like how do you exist? And in that, the way we perceive reality is almost exactly upside down. Is almost exactly upside down. If I'm hungry, my hunger seems very real. If I want a new phone, my want of the phone seems very real. If I'm working on a computer, the computer seems very real. I'm typing on it. It's right there, right? If I take some drops of water, throw them towards, they didn't, did it? Yeah, a few drops may have reached, right? These things seem real. But what is reality itself? Does any of this have reality of itself? Right? Has any of this have reality of itself? And the contention that we'll begin with is that in terms of reality, we see things upside down, right? In that the things that we perceive as being real, they're not what's truly real, right? I see this table and I feel it's real. Right? This is real. I feel that I'm real. This cup is real, right? The water in the cup is real. But if you zoom away, is that what's really real? Like if you imagine if you have a zoom button to existence. If you zoom more and more out of your own life, how real are you? Right? If you zoom away from yourself, right? Like imagine if you ever use Google Earth, you start zooming out, but you zoom out a little more, right? And zoom out. And then imagine if you could zoom out of time as well. How real is anything? Right? We think that the things around us and ourselves, we're real. But the reality is we're not. We're not. That we only have granted reality. We only have granted reality. The fact that we are created means that there's a creator. And as believers, we do believe in a creator. And we're not going to go into the proof of why we believe in Allah. But as believers, our starting point is that كان الله ولم يكن شيء غيره. The hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. Right? Allah was and there was nothing besides him. Which is more famous as كان الله ولا شيء معه. Which is a simpler expression. Allah was and there was nothing besides him. But the narration that is actually transmitted is كان الله ولم يكن شيء غيره. Allah was and there was nothing besides him. Right? He is the necessary being. And He is the necessary being. Only Allah necessarily exists. Anything else you look around you, did it have to exist? No. It was merely possible. Did I have to exist? No. Right? So how am I? Right? I am there because there's a necessary being. Right? We call him Allah. You can call him God. You can call him the supreme being. You can call him, right? The real, al-haq. Right? Everything else that is or could be is merely possible. Is merely possible. How does it have reality? Right? How does it have reality? Can it exist by itself? Could the cup just be? Like if I ask the cup, how are you? I don't, by the way, like don't worry too much about me. But if you were to ask the cup, how are you? It is giving that answer. Right? There is nothing in existence except that it is glorifying Allah's praises. Why? Because the fact that it is affirms the reality of the question, how are you? Which is, how are you? Like with a bold italics and underline under are. How are you? It is by Allah. Right? It's by the necessary being. Right? Everything around. So when I look at this cup, right, you can think about the cup is. And then you can think backwards. How is the cup? Well, the cup is created. Who created the cup? And you say, ultimately, it has a creator. But the reality is actually the other way around. What is more real? The cup or the one who created it? And the one who is sustaining it? Right? The reality is that I'm merely possible. I'm merely possible. I didn't have to exist. I didn't have to be born where I was born. I didn't have to live where I lived. I didn't have to like Real Madrid. Right? Or dislike Barcelona. Nothing personal, just any. Or any of these other things. Right? I'm merely possible. Everything that is possible, it was possible for me to have those qualities. Right? I could have been Italian. I could have been born before Leonardo da Vinci. I could have been a better artist than him. Right? Instead of Mona Lisa, it could be, it could be Layla. Right? My Layla. Right? Could be the famous painting that's sitting wherever it's sitting. So I'm merely possible. How do I exist? Who am I? Right? The question before who am I is how am I? I exist because Allah brought me into existence. But the substance that gives me existence is what? What is my personal identity? What is my personal reality? Like, what do I possess for myself? Nothing. Nothing whatsoever. Right? That only Allah necessarily is. Everything else, right, does not possess any intrinsic reality. Nothing. So how does it exist? It only comes into existence because Allah, the necessary being, the creator, brings it into existence. But then how does it stay there? How does it stay there? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustains it at every moment. That is its reality. And why is this important? Because to understand what is our identity as Muslims, we have to see, to know what are we, then who are we? And who are we comes from, where are we from? There's fundamental questions that define our understanding of anything. Who am I? Comes from, where am I from? How am I? So we only remain in existence, not just me, everything in existence, right, is only there because Allah is sustaining it. What is the identity of this cup? Yes, at this moment it is a cup, right? But, right? Actually, are you up for catching? Are you a catcher? Are you sure? I can throw. Okay, if I were to throw this cup, and I will, you have to move from your computer. Okay? If I were to throw this cup, and that's quite dramatic, right? If I were to throw this cup and it broke, is its identity still a cup? Well, right? What is its identity? Right? Is it glass? But how is it glass? Right? The fundamental reality of something is, where did it ultimately come from? Right? Where did it ultimately come from? And where did it ultimately come from? No, because the sand, where did the sand come from? Right? And where did the rocks come from? And where did the earth come from? Yeah. No, but okay, but the thing is, it's not that Allah created this world and then suddenly the world is. Right? Our belief, without doubt, is that Allah creates things, but He is sustaining them at every moment. Right? Were it not for Allah sustaining everything at every moment, they would cease to be. Right? And that's why He is Al-Qayyum. Right? He is the all-sustaining. And the greatest verse in the Quran is Ayat al-Kursi, because it tells us who Allah is. He is Al-Qayyum, Al-Hayy, the living, the grantor of all life. Al-Qayyum, the all-sustaining. Al-Qa'imu bi-nafsihi, al-Muqimu li-ghayrihi, the one who needs none to sustain him and who's sustaining everything in every way. So what's the identity of the cup? هذا خلق الله. This is the creating of Allah. Right? What is this wall? Well, it looks like a wall. But the answer to the question of identity is that everything is Allah's. We affirm this. Right? When someone dies, we affirm a truth unrelated to death. Right? What do we say when someone dies? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. What does that have to do with the person who just died? Directly. That death is a reminder. Inna lillah. We are Allah's. Right? And many times people translate that as we are from Allah. Right? We are from. But the lam here, of course, the lam in Arabic here is fascinating because it has many implications. Inna lillah. We are Allah's. Wa inna ilayhi raji'un. To Him are we returning. And what is our reality? We are Allah's. Why? Because He created us. We are Allah's because He is sustaining us. Wa inna ilayhi raji'un. When are we returning to Allah? When are we returning to Allah? No, it's a serious question. When are we returning to Allah? I'm not suggesting a date. Like, inshallah, we all have long lives. When do we return to Allah?
When we die.
When we die? On the day of resurrection?
Always.
Right? The reality is we are returning to Allah at every moment. The reality is we're returning to Allah at every moment. Why? Because the way we understand reality is that we do not possess anything. Even our own existence is granted by Allah. But He grants it, that's His khalq. Right? He creates things, but then He sustains it at every moment. Right? So, inna lillah, we are Allah's, and to Him are we ever returning. Wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And if you know a little bit of Arabic grammar, raji' is a type of what? Ism fa'il. It's a verbal noun, which is a type of masdar. Right? It indicates the meaning of the action without the time that it takes place. But this is وهو حقيقة في الحال مجاز في الاستقبال. It is literal immediately and only metaphorically true in the future. Right? The reality is that we are returning to Allah at every moment. At no moment are we independent of Allah. At no moment are we independent of Allah. Right? And this is a central realization of who are we that our religion tells us. That who are we? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us who we are in one of my favorite verses of the Quran. Right? who are you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a definition. Who are you? Ya ayyuhan nas, O people. Allah. The O people, I always stumble, I have to pause for a moment because there's this song by Ashik al-Rasul. It begins with a voiceover from an elderly scholar who says, "O people, come to me." I don't know where that is from, but it always says. But Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, antumul fuqara'u ila Allah. You are the ones. You are, right? Antum. You are. This is a statement of identity. Who are you? Like who are you meaning? Who are you? Right? Antumul fuqara'u ila Allah. You are in absolute need of Allah. Right? And the way it's structured in the Arabic, this is يفيد الاختصاص. أنتم الفقراء إلى الله. That you are the ones in absolute need of Allah. And this is a definitional statement. What defines you? You are the ones in absolute need of Allah. Wallahu huwa al-ghaniyyul hamid. And Allah, He is, meaning Allah alone is al-ghani, the one free of all need, al-hamid, worthy of all praise. And this is our identity. Our reality, who are you? Okay. Your reality is, at any moment, your most fundamental reality is, you're in a state of absolute need to Allah. Now, when we think of needing Allah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, مَا قَدَرُ اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ. They do not esteem Allah as He deserves to be esteemed. When do we normally think about needing Allah? When you're going through hardship. Right? I was in Amman once at an internet cafe. Right? This is like 13 years ago. And I was just trying to use the internet because it was down in my house. I had to check my email. And there's some gamers playing some network game. But alhamdulillah, in Muslim countries you see public manifestations of unexpected faith. So the guy sitting opposite me, he's like, Allahumma ansurna ala al-zalimin. Allahumma. He's making all these du'as. I was wondering what's going on. Initially, when I sat down, I didn't realize there's this network game taking place. This guy opposite making all this dua. I got up. I thought he was watching some video about, what's going on in Palestine. Or I went and it was one of those first-person shooter games. I was like, I was intrigued. Like, what happened? Because if you're in Jordan, all the time, sadly, you hear news. Today, this happened in Palestine. This happened. These number of people killed. This happened. People jailed. People's houses destroyed. Farmlands destroyed. So you keep hearing bad news. I'm like, what happened? It's like a game happened, right? That we think of neediness to Allah as being arid, right? As being accidental. Then I'm fine. I can deal with things. And then there is the Department of Life Trouble, DOLT, right? Which is, that's when you need Allah. Exam coming, oh Allah, I need to pass the exam, right? It's like Wizaratul Mashakil, right? The Ministry of Trouble is dua. You go, oh Allah, I need a job, right? Oh Allah, I need to marry Lubna, Zubayda, Zubair, whatever. But that's not your need for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? As one of the great scholars put, افتقارك إلى الله ذاتي. افتقارك إلى الله وصف ذاتي. That your neediness to Allah is an intrinsic attribute of you. It defines who you are. Right? والوصف الذاتي لا ينفك عن الموصوف. And an intrinsic attribute never leaves what it's an attribute of. You're always in need of Allah. That is your reality. أنتم الفقراء إلى الله. You are the ones in absolute need of Allah. When? At all times. At all times. what do you need Him for? What do you need Him for? But what's everything?
Sustenance, life sustenance.
Yeah. You need Him, first of all, for your very existence itself. Right? Right? As Ibn Ata'illah said, نِعْمَتَانِ لَا يَنْفَكُّ عَنْهُمَا مَوْجُودٌ. There are two blessings, two divine blessings, that nothing that exists is ever bereft of. Two blessings of Allah that nothing that exists is ever bereft of. نِعْمَةُ الْإِيجَادِ وَنِعْمَةُ الْإِمْدَادِ. The blessing of existing, right? Of being brought into existence. وَنِعْمَةُ الْإِمْدَادِ. And the blessing of being sustained at every moment. And that is how we perceive reality. That I don't need Allah just for some difficulties. And if you understand reality, do you need to remind Allah of what you need? Okay. Do you really need to? Well, Allah have an exam coming. Does He not know? Right? That's why Ibn Ata'illah in his hikam, what did he say? طَلَبُكَ مِنْهُ اتِّهَامٌ لَهُ. That you're asking of Him is an accusation of Him. When is your asking of Allah an accusation of Him? When you're, sometimes unconsciously, it's as if and Allah is merciful. That's not how Allah does not judge us on the basis of justice. Right? We don't ask Allah for His adl. We ask Him for His fadl, His bounty, His rahmah. Right? Why? Because if it were by justice, we'd all be gone. We say, oh Allah, and as if you're reminding Him, as if He doesn't know. أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ. There's one who created, not know. Right? Rather, what is dua? Dua itself, what is the reality of dua? Dua to Allah is not talabul hajat. Right? It's idharul faqat. Right? It's the expression of neediness. Right? That is, and it is expressed through our asking of our needs. Right? It's expressed through our asking of our needs. So we ask Allah. Right? But the asking is not just a list of demands. We do it as an expression of need. Which is why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ad-du'a mukhul ibadah." Dua is the essence, literally, is the marrow of worship, right? Is the essence of worship. Why? Because what is the heart of worship? Right? The essence, what does worship express? Al-iftiqaru ilallah, right? At-tadallul wal-iftiqaru ilallah. We humble ourselves and express our neediness to Allah. That is what worship expresses. That's why the climax of the prayer is the prostration. And the climax of the prayer is the prostration, because we express there that I am yours. I am in absolute neediness to you. Right? Prayer at its heart expresses neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And dua expresses that meaning, right? That's why dua is so meritorious. Because dua is not, if dua is only about asking your needs, oh Allah, today I need 7 things in my dunya and 3 things in my deen. Like it's like a menu, right? You go to the restaurant, like the spiritual restaurant, right? Today I'll have the such and such dish, right? I'll have mulukhiyah and this, and I'll have nahari. That's like a shopping list. No. We ask out of neediness to Allah. That's why dua is the essence of worship. Dua expresses the very meaning of what it means to be a believer. That's why Allah loves dua so much. Right? So this is how we define ourselves. Who are you? Who are we? We are in absolute need of Allah. Absolute need of Allah for existence itself. For at every moment we feel neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam expressed this and asked for this. Allahumma inni la amliku li nafsi naf'an wa la durran wa la hayatan wa la nushura. Allah, I do not possess for myself benefit nor harm, life nor resurrection. Right? But he also asked, Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum bi rahmatika astaghith, O all living, O all sustaining, in your mercy do I seek urgent aid, astaghith. فلا تكلني لنفسي طرفة عين ولا أقل من ذلك. Don't leave me to my own self, said the Prophet ﷺ, for the blinking of an eye or less than that. Why? Because I am not me. I am not myself. I am Allah's. Right? I am Allah's. Right? Right? I am Allah's. One of the pre-Islamic poets said that, of course, he was talking in different contexts, that talking about the one he loved, like, don't call me except as her servant. إِلَّا عَبْدَهَا فَإِنَّهُ أَشْرَفُ أَسْمَائِي. Because it is the most noble of my names. Okay? If you think, who are you? You are Allah's. Inna lillahi, right? We are Allah's. Right? That's our identity. And what are we supposed to do? وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. And we are ever returning to Him at every moment. But there's a temporal, a worldly aspect to that. That at every moment we're returning to Him, but there's a point of return that Allah has, out of His mercy, demarcated. That at least fix up yourself for the outward return. Right? And this is what we express. Right? Who are we? It is expressed daily in Surah Al-Fatiha. Surah Al-Fatiha begins with a statement of who is Allah. Who is Allah? The first half of Surah Al-Fatiha defines who is Allah, as you well know. Then it defines for us, who are we? Right? إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدْ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينَ. It is you we worship, and it is you alone we rely upon, that we seek assistance of. Right? And of course, this also put that the basis of your identity is derivative. Right? We don't say نَعْبُدُكَ وَنَسْتَعِينُكَ وَنَسْتَعِينُ بِكَ. Right? We say إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. It is you we worship. Because in reality, what matters more, you or Allah? Allah. Right? It is you alone we worship. Right? It is you alone. And what is worship? Worship is غاية التذلل إظهار غاية التذلل والافتقار إلى الله. Right? Worship, or إلى المعبود. Right? It's expressing, worship, ibadah, is expressing complete submission and complete neediness to the one worshipped. And what is worship? Worship is how you express your neediness. Right? Which is why the early Muslims referred to ibadah as qutul qulub. It is the sustenance of our souls. Right? It is the sustenance. وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. It is you alone we rely upon. Why? Because what do we possess for ourselves? Nothing. Right? Right? Nothing. Right? In absolute terms. Of course, in relative terms, this is mine, and this is mine, and this is mine, and that's yours, and we express that. But to understand what is relatively true, we have to begin with what is absolutely true. Right? We have to begin with what's absolutely true. Because if it weren't for what's absolutely true, right, nothing else actually has meaning, right? And that's a philosophical question, but there's a philosophy to ethics, right? That if I am whoever I want to be, right, then on what basis, let's say Amr says that that's his laptop. I say, no. I feel like it's mine. Now deal with that. Right? There's no philosophically sustainable way that, if you affirm relativism, then you can defend, say, well, don't hurt other people. So why? Why shouldn't you hurt other people? It's not right. If there's no consequence to anything, why shouldn't I hurt other people? Why should I care? And you're seeing, of course, that unfold, and it's not at all unexpected. Okay? Things like post-truth and all these things, and someone lying to another country's prime minister. Oh, that was so bad. Why is it so bad? Right? Because what we do in life begins with understanding how reality is in life. Right? So sorry, this is a bit of a heavy start, but it's an important question, right? That who are we is very fundamental, right? Who are we? Inna lillah, right? We are Allah's. Why? Because we exist by Allah bringing us into existence. We remaining in existence because Allah is sustaining us at every moment. And given that He's sustaining us in every moment, reality is that at every moment we are returning to Allah. But in this life, and what we do in it is how we play out our journey with Allah, if we're conscious of Him, and to Allah, minimally. Right? So, now what is the path of good return? Right? The path of good return is outlined throughout the Quran. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرِ. Truly you have in the Messenger of Allah the most beautiful of examples, the most beautiful of exemplars. Right? لِمَنْ كَانَ, for whoever seeks, for whoever hopes for, right, Allah and the next life. Right? That's the second aspect of our identity, right? Who am I? I'm from Allah. What am I supposed to be doing? Right? I'm supposed to identify as a follower of the Prophet ﷺ, right? What's my identity? I am a servant of Allah. And how do I play out that how do I live that servitude? I am a follower of the Prophet ﷺ, right? What should govern our actions? Who am I? I'm Allah's. And there's nothing more liberating than that. Right? Why do you stand up for the truth? Because I'm a servant of God. And that's what's beloved to Him. Truth, mercy, justice. Right? It's not because, well, I want to do the right thing. Look, let's go grab pizza instead. Right? It's more appealing than doing the right thing. Right? And it's more immediate. It's more fruitful because you'll taste it right away. Right? The only meaning that sustainably matters is this. Everything else, it's an element of delusion. So this is how we frame it. But this gives a lot of clarity. Right? Of course, the question arises, what about other identities? What about other identities? Okay? All these other identities that are genuine are affirmed. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, right, that He has created us شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا لِتَعَارَفُوا. He has created us as nations and tribes. Right? Why? So that we and there's a wisdom in it, that we may come to know one another. We affirm those identities of background, of language, of culture, of place of origin, of occupation. All of these are recognized, but they're given their due place. But that's not your reality. Because if your reality is that I am a doctor. If that's your primary identity, what if you have an accident and you can no longer practice? Is who you are changed? No, it's not. I am an activist. But suddenly, there's one person I know, they didn't manage to have children for a long, long time. They made a lot of dua. Sometimes you have to be careful what you make dua for. And they had multiple children, all in one burst. Several over just a couple of years. They identified, if you ask them, who are you? Say, I'm an activist. I'm a community activist. I do this. Now suddenly, the only activism you're doing is actively changing diapers. Okay? Actively cleaning up vomit. And, actively trying to catch up on your sleep. And a lot of people struggle with that. But that's not who you are. That's not who you are. Right? This is why we recognize these many different identities. And if deployed correctly, they're part of the richness of life. They're part of the richness of life. Right? Part of the wisdom of the way Allah, وَاخْتِلَافُ أَلْوَانِكُمْ وَأَلْسِنَتِكُمْ. And Allah uses as one of the proofs of the divine is the differences in our colors and our tongues. And there's proof in that for the divine. If you look at Surah Rum, right, Allah uses all these various things as examples. So that's a little bit that we wanted to touch upon regarding this question, who am I? Right? Ustad Amjad, after the break, will be talking about identity and the prophetic mirror. So we'll pause here, inshallah ta'ala. Sorry for the heavy start. Some people don't like thinking, right? But it doesn't hurt too much. Sidi Amjad will be a lot more inspiring. There's this British series in the 80s called Blackadder. And in one episode, Blackadder's personal servant decided to run to be a member of parliament from a rotten borough. But the candidate never spoke. So the series had this interview with Baldrick, his candidate, with a carrot in his mouth. And they said, Mr. Blackadder, we have noticed that your candidate is not speaking during this election. He said, yes, you see, we are running this election on issues and not personalities. He says, that's very novel. Why would you do that? He said, as you can see, our candidate does not have a personality. So similarly, sorry if this wasn't inspiring, because inshallah, Sidi Amjad's a lot more inspiring, but inshallah this inspired some thought regarding the question, who am I? As Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have shown us. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد معلم الناس الخير وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.